Imagine holding the very evidence of your own end, recording your killer as he walks towards you across a rusted, skeletal bridge. In 2017, 14-year-old Libby German did exactly that. She captured a grainy figure in a blue jacket, the man the world would come to know as Bridge Man. For 5 agonizing years, his voice, ordering 2 girls down the hill, haunted every corner of the internet. The terrifying paradox? The police already had his name in their files from day one. He was hiding in plain sight, just miles from the crime scene, waiting for the clock to run out. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. Delphi, Indiana is the kind of place where the geography is defined more by its history than its expansion. It is a town of 3,000 souls tucked away in Carroll County, where the skyline is dominated by grain elevators and the quiet rustle of the Wabash River. A place where the communal sense of security wasn't just a feeling, it was an inheritance. On the morning of February 13th, 2017, that inheritance was still intact. The town's residents went about their business with the easy confidence of a community that hadn't seen a violent crime in decades. The concept of stranger danger felt like a relic of big city news broadcasts, something that happened in Indianapolis or Chicago, not here among the sycamores and the quiet creek beds. Libby German and Abigail Williams were the heartbeat of this quiet landscape. Libby, at 14, was a force of nature, a girl with a camera always in hand and a mind that moved faster than the small town pace around her. She was a scholar, an athlete, and a technician of the digital age, often seen on the volleyball court or practicing her saxophone. Her home life was anchored by her grandparents, Becky and Mike German, who provided a foundation of stability in a world that Libby was eager to explore through her lens. She was the one who kept the family's technical world running, often helping her grandparents with their computers or setting up the latest gadgets. There was a specific vitality to Libby. She was always thinking about the next shot, the next angle. Then there was Abby. At 13, Abigail Williams was the quieter resonance to Libby's bright melody. She was a girl of gentle spirits and artistic leanings, possessing a kindness that her mother, Anna, described as a natural, quiet gravity. While Libby was the one leading the way with a smartphone and a plan, Abby was the steady companion, the friend who didn't need to speak to be understood. Their bond was the sort of teenage alchemy that turned a boring Monday into an adventure, forged through shared secrets and the countless hours spent navigating the transition from childhood to the threshold of something more. Abby played the trumpet in the school band and shared Libby's love for the arts, but she carried herself with a modesty that balanced Libby's more outgoing personality. The day of February 13th was an anomaly, a gift of unseasonable warmth in the middle of a Midwestern winter. The schools were closed for a scheduled winter break day, leaving the youth of Delphi with a rare afternoon of freedom. The air was crisp but lacked the usual bite of February, the thermometer hovering in the low 50s, just enough to tempt anyone out of the house and into the woods. Libby and Abby, restless and seeking the outdoors, decided on the Monon High Bridge Trail. This wasn't an unusual request. In Delphi, the trail system was considered an extension of the town's backyard. It was a place where generations of kids had walked, carved their initials into trees, and tested their courage on the heights of the old rail bridge. To the families, the idea of 2 girls spending a few hours in the woods was as mundane as a trip to the library. The decision to go to the bridge wasn't actually the first plan. The girls had spent the morning sleeping in and lounging, as teenagers do when a holiday grants them a reprieve from the classroom. It was only as the sun climbed higher and the temperature defied the calendar that the idea of the hike took shape. Libby's grandmother, Becky, remembered the day as one of those rare moments where the world seemed perfectly aligned. The chores were done, the house was peaceful, and the girls were in high spirits. There was a lightheartedness in the air that usually precedes a memory you want to keep forever, not a nightmare you can never escape. Becky had given her blessing, and with that, the gears of the afternoon began to turn. Kelsey German, Libby's older sister, was the one who navigated the logistics of their daily lives. On that Monday, the conversation about the bridge was casual. The weather was inviting, and the trail offered a perfect backdrop for the photos Libby loved to post on social media. When Kelsey agreed to drop them off at the trail's entrance around 1:35 in the afternoon, it was a routine favor. She watched them disappear into the trailhead, later recalling how she'd told them she loved them, a standard farewell that would soon take on the weight of a final blessing. The girls were dressed for a hike, Libby in tie-dye and sweatshirts, Abby in a light jacket. They were armed only with their phones and the invincible confidence of youth. The plan was solidified. Kelsey drops them off, and Libby's father, Derek, picks them up later. As Kelsey pulled the car away from the trailhead at the Hoosier Heartland Highway, she saw them in the rearview mirror, two figures standing at the edge of the trees, ready to plunge into the brown and gray landscape of the Indiana woods. They were small against the backdrop of the towering timber, but they were together. And in the minds of everyone who loved them, together meant safe. As they walked deeper into the woods, the sounds of the highway began to fade, replaced by the crunch of dried leaves and the distant, rhythmic call of crows. The Monon High Bridge awaited them at the end of the trail, a massive monument to a bygone era that was about to become the most analyzed location in modern criminal history. The trail leading to the Monon High Bridge is less a path and more a corridor through a fading history, a line of packed dirt and gravel that follows the ghost of the Monon Railroad, which once cut through the heart of Indiana's industrial landscape. To a stranger, the woods in mid-February might appear bleak, a skeleton of gray trunks and skeletal branches reaching toward a pale sky. No, to Libby and Abby, this was their territory. They moved with the ease of locals, their boots crunching through a carpet of dry, rusted oak leaves that had survived the winter. The air was still, save for the occasional distant hum of a tractor, or the sharp, echoing cry of a red-tailed hawk circling the creek beds. As the girls walked deeper into the woods, the world began to narrow. The trail eventually gives way to the bridge itself, a massive iron and timber structure that looms 63 feet above the waters of Deer Creek. It is 853 feet of history, standing as a testament to the engineering of the late 1800s, now surrendered to the elements. The Monon High Bridge is not for the faint of heart. It has no handrails, no safety netting, only the weathered wooden railroad ties spaced unevenly, with gaps that allow a clear, dizzying view of the rocky creek bed below. The physical sensation of being on that bridge is one of intense isolation. On a windy day, the iron vibrates, a low-frequency hum that travels from the soles of your shoes up through your spine. To cross it, you must focus. You have to watch where your feet land, ensuring you don't slip on the moss-slicked wood or trip over the rusted spikes that still jut out from the timber. For teenagers in Delphi, crossing the bridge was a rite of passage, a test of nerves that yielded the ultimate reward, a vantage point where you could see for miles over the rolling Indiana timberland. At 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby pulled out her phone. She was a child of the digital age, understanding instinctively that a moment wasn't just lived, it was captured. She opened Snapchat and took a photo of Abby. In the image, Abby is walking away from the camera, her head tilted down as she watches her footing on the precarious ties. She's wearing a light-colored jacket, her hands partially tucked into her sleeves against the afternoon chill. There is nothing in the frame to suggest terror. No shadow looming in the background. Just a girl on a bridge, framed by the stark brown beauty of the woods. It is a hauntingly quiet image, the final digital footprint of a peaceful afternoon. But the bridge is a dead end. Once you reach the far side, the southeast end, the tracks simply vanish into a wall of private property and dense tangled brush. There is no easy exit. To leave, you must either turn around and walk back the way you came, facing whoever might be following you, or you must descend the steep, treacherous embankments that lead down to the water. The geography itself is a trap. It was shortly after that final photo that the atmosphere changed. The rhythmic sound of their own footsteps was joined by another, a heavier, more deliberate gait. A man had appeared at the north end of the bridge, beginning his walk toward them. He didn't look like a hiker. He didn't have the gear or the light-hearted stride of someone out to enjoy the unseasonable warmth. He was a discordant note in a familiar song. He wore a blue-gray windbreaker, flared at the waist as if overstuffed, and a pair of blue jeans that looked several sizes too large, bunching at the ankles. A brown hoodie was pulled up, partially obscured by a cap. Libby, with a chillingly mature intuition, sensed the danger before it became physical. She didn't put her phone away. Instead, she switched from photos to video, holding the device at her side, capturing the man's approach without him knowing. In the grainy, stabilized footage, we see him, the bridge man. He walks with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his head down, looking at the ties. His stride is heavy, purposeful, the walk of a man who knows exactly where the bridge ends and where the girls are trapped. The video captures more than just his image. It captures the sound of the woods being violated. As he closes the distance, the wind dies down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence. Then, a voice. It isn't a scream or a cinematic snarl. It is a low, gravelly command that sounds terrifyingly mundane, like a neighbor telling you to move out of the way. He utters the words that would be analyzed by the FBI and millions of onlookers for the next half-decade. Guys, down the hill. In those 4 words, the hike ended. The girls were forced off the safety of the iron structure and pushed toward the steep, muddy incline that led toward the creek. The terrain there is punishing, thick with brambles and hidden roots, the ground soft with the thaw of February. As they descended down the hill, they were moving away from the trail, away from the sightline of any potential witnesses, and into the deep, shadowed silence of the valley. The man followed, leaving the bridge empty. The rusted iron standing silent once again, holding only the echoes of the command that had just shattered 2 families. The command was not a shout. It was a cold, efficient directive that stripped the afternoon of its remaining warmth. When the man in the blue-gray jacket uttered those 4 words, "Guys, down the hill!" the girls were forced to abandon the relative visibility of the high bridge's iron skeleton. They were ushered toward the southeast embankment, a place where the earth drops away in a steep, punishing grade of mud and tangled brush. This was no longer a hike, it was a forced march into the shadows. The descent was treacherous, the kind of terrain where every step is a gamble against gravity, yet they were being driven by a presence that allowed for no hesitation. As they reached the bottom of the incline, the landscape transformed. They were no longer overlooking the valley, they were buried within it. The sound of the wind through the upper branches was replaced by the low, steady gurgle of Deer Creek, a body of water that, in February, is a freezing slate-gray ribbon of ice and snowmelt. To move forward, they were forced into the water. The creek at that point is not deep, but the current is insistent, and the bed is a chaotic arrangement of slick stones and hidden drop-offs. The cold would have been instantaneous, a biting, numbing sensation that soaked through their boots and climbed their legs, turning their muscles heavy and slow. On the other side of the creek lay a private woodlot, a secluded bottoms area where the trees grow thick and the sightlines to any road or trail are completely severed. It was here, in a hollow shielded by the rising banks and the dense timber, that the encounter reached its final, horrific climax. The world outside continued to move. Cars passed on the Hoosier Heartland Highway, and neighbors in nearby houses went about their Monday routines. But in this specific pocket of the woods, the silence was absolute. Whatever transpired occurred in a window of time so narrow it defies the imagination, a brutal disruption of reality that left the woods forever changed. By 3:11 p.m., the first ripple of concern reached the trailhead. Derek German, Libby's father, pulled his vehicle into the designated pickup spot near the old North Fitzpatrick Road. He was on time, expecting to see 2 wind-blown teenagers emerging from the trees, perhaps complaining about the cold or showing off photos from their trek. But the trailhead was empty. He waited, the engine idling, the minutes ticking past the agreed-upon time. He dialed Libby's cell phone. It rang and rang, the rhythmic, mechanical tone eventually giving way to the impersonal prompt of her voicemail. He called again and again. The initial annoyance of a parent waiting on a tardy child quickly began to curdle into something sharper. Derek knew Libby was responsible, and more importantly, he knew she was tethered to her phone. For her to miss a call was rare. For her to miss multiple calls was a signal. He began to walk a short distance into the woods, calling their names. The trees offered no response. By 3:30 p.m., he contacted the rest of the family. The communal sense of together means safe was the first thing to shatter. If they were together and still not answering, they weren't just lost, they were incapacitated. By late afternoon, the German and Williams families had converged on the trail. What had begun as a private search escalated with terrifying speed. They fanned out across the paths, their voices echoing through the timber, calling for Libby and Abby until their throats were raw. They checked the bridge. They looked over the sides into the dizzying heights. They scoured the creek banks. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the leaf litter, the unseasonable warmth of the day evaporated. The temperature began to plummet, returning to the harsh reality of an Indiana winter. By 5:30 p.m., the local authorities were officially notified. The Delphi Police Department and the Carroll County Sheriff's Office arrived, but their initial assessment was hampered by the very nature of the town. This was Delphi. Kids drifted off trails all the time. They got lost, they stayed out too late, or their phones died. There was a lingering hope, a desperate, flickering thing, that the girls had simply walked too far and come out at a different trailhead, or were sitting in a local diner waiting for a ride. But as the golden hour passed and darkness began to swallow the woods, the scale of the emergency became undeniable. The night search was a masterpiece of community desperation. Hundreds of volunteers from Delphi and the surrounding counties arrived with flashlights and thermal scanners. The woods were transformed into a sea of bobbing lights, a grid of human effort trying to pierce the pitch-black Indiana night. Firefighters, police officers, and neighbors moved in line formations, their boots heavy in the mud, their breaths blooming in the freezing air. They pushed through thickets and navigated the treacherous bridge in the dark, calling out into a void that refused to speak back. Every ping of a cell phone tower was analyzed. Every distant sound, the snap of a branch or the rustle of a nocturnal animal, brought the searchers to a breathless halt. But the girls remained ghosts. Around midnight, under the advice of law enforcement, and due to the extreme danger posed by the terrain in the dark, the formal search was officially called off until daybreak. It was a decision that felt like a betrayal to the families. They were told to go home, to wait for the light, while their daughters were out in the freezing dark, somewhere down the hill. That night, the town of Delphi didn't sleep. Lights stayed on in every window along the quiet streets. The silence of the town was heavy, thick with the realization that the safety they had taken for granted was an illusion. The bridge was still there, a massive iron shadow in the woods, holding the secret of what had happened in the 2 minutes and 13 seconds since Libby had pressed record. The morning was coming, and with it, a discovery that would ensure the people of Delphi would never look at their woods or their neighbors the same way again. The scale of the search had ballooned overnight. Hundreds of volunteers, some who had traveled from 3 counties away, gathered at the command post. There was a desperate, hushed energy in the air, the sound of hundreds of boots shuffling through gravel and the low, urgent crackle of police radios. They were organized into tighter, more systematic grids. The hope that the girls were simply lost was being systematically dismantled by the sheer passage of time and the plummeting temperatures. No 2 teenage girls, no matter how resourceful, would choose to stay out in this freezing Indiana dampness unless they had no choice. By late morning, the focus narrowed toward the area east of the high bridge. Searchers fanned out along both sides of Deer Creek, moving through the dense timber of the private woodlots that bordered the water. The terrain was punishing, thick with thorn bushes that tore at clothing and steep, muddy embankments that threatened to send anyone sliding toward the gray, rushing water below. The silence of the woods was profound, broken only by the calling of names, voices that were growing increasingly hoarse and ragged as the hours ticked toward noon. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the world in Delphi stopped turning. A group of searchers on the north bank of Deer Creek, roughly half a mile upstream from the bridge, came to a sudden, petrified halt. They had spotted something in a secluded hollow, an area heavily shielded by the curve of the bank and the density of the old-growth timber. First, it was a glimpse of color that didn't belong in the brown and gray winter landscape, a piece of clothing. Then, the full reality of the scene came into focus. The bodies of Liberty German and Abigail Williams were found on private property, roughly 50 feet from the water's edge. They were still, framed by the cold earth and the silent trees. A sight that would haunt the volunteers for the rest of their lives. The initial reaction was a crushing, absolute silence, followed by a wave of radio transmissions that were thick with shock and grief. "We have found them," was the message that rippled through the search lines, but the tone of the voice told the rest of the town what they didn't want to hear. This wasn't a rescue. Within minutes, the area was flooded with law enforcement. The wooded hollow was quickly cordoned off with yellow tape, a bright, artificial barrier that marked the boundary between the peaceful world of Delphi and a theater of unimaginable violence. The crime scene itself was an island of stillness. The girls had been found in a location that suggested they had been led there with intent, away from the eyes of the world and the safety of the trail. The details of the scene were immediately guarded by the authorities with a level of secrecy that was almost unprecedented. They didn't speak of the cause of death. They didn't describe the state of the victims. This silence served two purposes: to protect the integrity of the investigation and to shield the families from a level of horror that no one should have to visualize. However, the presence of the FBI and the immediate arrival of state crime lab technicians signaled that this was not an accident or a tragedy of the elements. It was a double homicide. The atmosphere in the town shifted from frantic hope to a paralyzed, vibrating fear. As the news of the grim discovery broke, the streets of Delphi emptied. Parents rushed to schools to pick up their children. Doors that had gone unlocked for decades were bolted and barred. The realization was as cold as the creek water. The girls had been captured by a predator who was likely still out there. The bridge, once a place of local pride and teenage adventure, was now a monument to a massacre. It loomed over the valley like a skeletal sentinel, a silent witness to the final minutes of Libby and Abby. As the bodies were respectfully recovered and transported for autopsies, the investigation began to take its first faltering steps. The police had a timeline, they had a location, and, unknown to the public at that exact moment, they had the voice and the image of the killer. But as the sun set on that first day of the new reality, the fog didn't lift. It only grew thicker. The search was over, but the hunt for the man who had walked across the iron ties was only just beginning. The community of Delphi had lost more than two of its daughters. It had lost its soul, replaced by a lingering, toxic suspicion that the monster they were looking for might be the person standing next to them in the grocery line. The investigation into the deaths of Libby and Abby was not a sprint. It was a war of attrition against a phantom that had left behind the ultimate piece of evidence, yet remained utterly invisible. Within 48 hours of the discovery, the Indiana State Police released a still image captured from Libby German's phone. It was the Bridge Man, a grainy, pixelated figure caught mid-stride on the rusted iron ties. A few days later, they released the audio. The world heard that gravelly command tone voice for the first time. It was a digital ghost, a Rorschach test for a terrified public. To some, he looked like a local farmer. To others, a drifter. To the investigators sitting in the makeshift task force headquarters at the Delphi United Methodist Church, he was a puzzle that refused to be solved despite having a face and a voice. The first few months were defined by a staggering volume of information. Tips poured in by the thousands, over 50,000 in the first few years alone. The FBI, the state police, and the local sheriff's department were drowning in a sea of names, theories, and lookalikes. Every man in Carroll County who owned a blue jacket and walked with a slight hitch was scrutinized. The town of Delphi became a place of whispers. People stopped looking at the woods and started looking at their neighbors' driveways. They noticed whose lights stayed on late, who stopped going to the local grocery store, and who suddenly decided to wash their truck in the middle of a winter freeze. The first major red herring that gripped the investigation, and the public's imagination, was the property where the girls were found. Ron Logan, the elderly owner of the farm that bordered Deer Creek, became the center of a forensic hurricane. To many, the logic seemed inescapable. The girls were on his land, and he had a history of minor legal troubles. The FBI executed massive search warrants on his home, his outbuildings, and his trash. They analyzed his alibi, which involved a trip to a nearby town to buy tropical fish. Despite the intensity of the scrutiny, the evidence simply wasn't there. Logan would eventually pass away years later, his name still tethered to a crime he likely didn't commit, a victim of the investigation's desperate need for a tangible villain. Then came the sketches, the most controversial and confusing element of the 5-year hunt. In July 2017, the police released a composite drawing of an older man, perhaps in his 50s, with a goatee and a prominent cap. This became the face of the killer for nearly 2 years. But in April 2019, the investigation took what Superintendent Doug Carter called a new direction. At a cinematic high-tension press conference, the older sketch was tossed aside in favor of a younger man, a figure appearing to be in his 20s or 30s, with curly hair and a more slender build. The public was told that the killer was likely between the ages of 18 and 40, and that he might be hiding in plain sight, possibly even in the room during the press conference. This pivot created a massive schism in the search. Was there one man? Two? Was the sketch a composite of witnesses or a specific individual? The confusion fueled a burgeoning community of online sleuths who began to target anyone who resembled either drawing. This digital vigilantism led to the harassment of dozens of innocent men, turning the investigation into a chaotic, multi-headed beast. The police, meanwhile, were pivoting toward a digital lead that seemed to promise a breakthrough, the Anthony_Shots profile. Investigators discovered that a fake social media profile, using the photos of a male model, had been communicating with Libby German in the days leading up to the hike. The profile was traced back to Keegan Kline, a young man living in nearby Peru, Indiana. For a moment, it seemed the ghost had been caught. The connection between online grooming and the physical location of the murders was too strong to ignore. The task force spent years diving into the dark corners of Kline's digital life. But the direct link to the Monon High Bridge remained elusive. It was another labyrinthine dead end that ate up thousands of man-hours while the real bridge man continued his life in Delphi. The true tragedy of the investigation, however, was not what the police couldn't find. It was what they already had. In the chaotic first days of the search, in February 2017, a local man had reached out to a conservation officer. He didn't call the tip line. He met the officer in a grocery store parking lot. He admitted he had been on the Monon High Bridge on the afternoon of the 13th. He told the officer he was there between 1:30 and 3:30 p.m. He even described his clothing, a blue-gray jacket and blue jeans. He mentioned seeing 3 juvenile females on the trail. This man was Richard Allen. Through a catastrophic clerical error, this interview was misfiled or ignored. Because the conservation officer was not part of the primary investigative team, his notes were reportedly labeled as cleared or simply lost in a mounting pile of paper. For 5 years, the name of a man who placed himself at the scene, wearing the killer's clothes during the exact window of the murders, sat in a file cabinet. Richard Allen didn't flee Delphi. He didn't go into hiding. He continued to work as a pharmacy technician at the local CVS, the very place where the victims' families went to pick up their prescriptions. He processed their photos. He chatted with them across the counter. He was the ultimate ghost, the one who never left. It wasn't until 2022 when a fresh pair of eyes, reportedly a volunteer or a new clerk reorganizing the digital archives, came across the original 2017 interview notes. The realization was a thunderclap. The details provided by Allen 5 years earlier perfectly matched the witness statements and the footage on Libby's phone. The investigation, which had traveled thousands of miles across digital footprints and out-of-state leads, suddenly collapsed back onto a small brick house on Whiteman Drive in the heart of Delphi. The ghost hunt was over. The reality of the man in the blue jacket was finally coming to light, and it was far more mundane and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. In October 2022, the 5-year stalemate shattered when police executed a search warrant on Richard Allen's home. They didn't find a bloody trophy room. They found a family man living a life of quiet suburban invisibility. But in a drawer, they recovered a Sig Sauer P226, a weapon that forensic experts linked to a single, unspent .40 caliber round found in the dirt between Libby and Abby's bodies. The tool mark analysis became the centerpiece of a trial that began in late 2024, exposing a narrative far more twisted than a simple chance encounter. The defense fought back with a sprawling theory of ritualistic sacrifice involving Odinism, but the prosecution countered with a devastating blow. Allen had reportedly confessed to the murders more than 60 times during recorded prison calls to his wife. On November 11, 2024, the jury delivered their verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts of murder, finally putting a face to the ghost that had haunted the Mononhai Bridge, and ensuring the man in the blue jacket would never walk free again. Delphi. Today is no longer defined by a ghost, but by the resilience of those who stayed behind. The Abigail and Liberty Memorial Park stands as a sanctuary of playgrounds and ball fields where children's laughter fills the air that was once thick with terror. The command down the hill has lost its power to frighten, replaced by the legacy of Libby's courage, the presence of mind that ensured a killer's face would be known to the world. The woods are quiet now, the iron bridge remains still,